Wasn't it something the way all the cars and people slid out of the way like chocolate melting? Cynthia knew it had something to do with the siren crying out as they glided across the crowded lanes, but she had stopped concentrating. She couldn't take any more of their youngest receding into a dark, silent world, dead asleep at 4:30 in the afternoon on a school day. And when she saw the vial of pills, weed, cigarettes, and beer cans under Lauren's bed, she had texted David at his lab in Cambridge, and when he didn't text back right away, she had panicked and dialed 911. They had tried grounding Lauren when she stayed out past her midnight curfew. They had tried shutting off her phone when she didn't come home until dawn. They had tried insisting she go to school like a regular kid in the last year of high school and enlisted Lawrence Peterson, the special ed director at the high school, for help. And now here she was. A few minutes later, David finally sent a text, "I'm in a meeting, what's going on?" By then it was too late to undial the numbers, the whole pitiful scene already in motion, the doorbell sounding and Cynthia opening the front door to a view of uniformed men and an ambulance, fire truck, and 2 police cars parked at the bottom of the small cul-de-sac where they lived at 57 Beach Circle. Cynthia remembered thinking how quaint their street looked when the realtor showed them the house 5 years ago, quiet and tucked away, a place where a happy family lived. It had been such a coup to land the sale of the stately brick house they now possessed. "Is the fire truck necessary?" she asked the lead officer, letting him in. "It's protocol." "She's upstairs, 3rd floor." Cynthia led them down the hall to the contemporary floating stairway in the living room, renovated along with a complete redo of the kitchen the previous fall. 2 more young men in plain dark clothes, each carrying a medical bag, followed, and a stockier, older policeman formed the caboose as she rounded the staircase to the 2nd floor landing and stopped at the bottom of the attic stairs leading to Lauren's bedroom on the 3rd floor. "She's up there," she pointed, letting them pass. She didn't want to go up again. The train of strangers trudged up the carpeted attic stairs, and soon she heard them talking. "Lauren, how are you doing?" she heard one officer say. Lauren answered, but Cynthia couldn't make out what her daughter said, her attention distracted by the sound of David coming up the floating stairway. He stood beside her. "The police and medics are with her. I think she's okay," Cynthia said, breathing the scent of winter air emanating from David's green ski jacket. "I'm going up," he said. She watched him climb the narrow, steep path that cut between 2 solid walls. He was in his usual work attire, black jeans and sneakers. It's what they all wore at the lab where his team designed tiny robots, nanotechnology that promised to deliver chemotherapy with less side effects to cancer patients. "Why?" she heard Lauren say upstairs. "Protocol," one of the officers said. "We need you to take a ride with us, okay?" Cynthia shivered from the draft coming down from Lauren's windows. Her daughter opened them when she smoked. It was a stupid cat and mouse game they played, Lauren pretending she wasn't smoking weed or cigarettes, Cynthia pretending she didn't notice, but the dank smell had a way of bleeding through the rest of the house. David was the first to come down the stairs. "I'll get the car," he said. "You go in the ambulance. I'll meet you there." The 2 young medics, one in front, one behind, carried Lauren down in a stretcher, her daughter refusing to look at her as they passed by. Cynthia ached at the sight of her daughter strapped in, her wild black hair covering her face, and, in recent months, too thin, a fussy vegetarian who sometimes threw up after a meal. Cynthia knew this because she could hear the toilet flushing too many times after dinner. She couldn't get used to this change in her once even-keeled daughter, as if some biological switch had turned on, releasing darkness that no one was able to turn off. Outside, Cynthia felt embarrassed, mortified by the ambulance and police cars for everyone to see. In her charcoal black pencil skirt and matching sweater, a string of pearls around her neck, she stepped gingerly over the front walk pavers to avoid catching her heels in the grout. She'd forgotten her coat, and it was cold, damn it. Her colleagues at work often commented on her impeccable dress, something she took pride in. Now she simply felt absurd. It was too late to go back and grab her coat. Stupid of her. She tried not to think of neighbors watching. Most were still away in Florida for the winter, except for her colleague Rachel Cohen, who lost her husband last year and moved into the carriage house next door as a temporary thing, something about needing a change. It was Cynthia who told Rachel about the rental, which made her twinge with regret. She disliked mixing her private and professional life, but it was too late for that, wasn't it? She lifted her chin and kept looking straight ahead. As a funding director, Cynthia had awarded Rachel a 3-year grant for her environmental school curriculum project, but something about Rachel, so alone and widowed, had caused Cynthia to make an exception to her professional versus privacy rule. She hoped Rachel wasn't home. The driver of the ambulance opened the passenger door for her. Need help? I'm fine. She climbed into the front seat and tried to smile, let him know she was still in control, but could only manage a tight-lipped upturn of her lips. She guessed the driver was about 27, a young man who probably lived in a crummy apartment in Allston or East Boston. She could see him lying on a worn sofa after work, the springs touching the floor beneath, leftover crusts of pizza crushed beneath tired cushions. She felt like a tired cushion and sat straighter in the seat to prevent herself from collapsing. David appeared on her side by the window and tapped on it. All set? Her husband registered like a shadow, and then the young driver closed his door and they were off, smooth and fast, up the small hill of the cul-de-sac, 2 turns onto Beacon Street, the wide boulevard that ran east-west through the center of Woodbury to downtown Boston. Mother and daughter on board, the driver said to his walkie-talkie, be there in 10. Stiff and cold in the passenger seat, Cynthia squeezed her shoulder blades. Would you mind turning up the heat? Sure, no problem. The young driver with shiny black hair and brown skin twisted a dial, which caused tiny jets of hot air to rush out of the vents. She wiggled her fingertips to warn them. Thank you. She leaned back, relieved. Thank you so much. The heat was such a small, good thing, so simple, so desperately small and simple. That's it.
Unmute everyone.
Fantastic.
Very vivid.
Very nice.
All right, now I can mute you all again. How's that?
Now I can.
Oh, sorry, hold on. So we're going to go, here we are. And my apologies, this is also on a live feed to Facebook, Jessica, and I forgot that I do that now. And so I started it maybe a minute into your reading, but
Oh, that's okay.
we'll wow people with the questions. And we got some really, really great questions tonight. So this is what we got for tonight. All right. What was working at the Atlantic like?
Oh, well, I mean, in some ways it was incredibly exciting. I mean, it was the Atlantic, and I felt really privileged to be there. I was there during the summer. I was reading fiction submissions, and I think they had about 200 a week. I mean, and so it was like this, endless stream. And it was my job to read through quickly and pull out anything that that looked of more interest to pass it on to the fiction editor, Michael Curtis, actually. But it was also to do that constantly all day long could be somewhat numbing too. So it was a struggle to sort of keep myself alert. But then they started asking me to write these little short critiques of stories, and I really had a good time doing that. That was fun. And there was this woman named Phoebe who wrote reviews, and she used to walk in every day with this big hat and smoke cigarettes in the back, and she didn't say anything, and she would just type on her typewriter. I mean, it was just so old school. And then her husband, was like this Beacon Hill guy and would pick her up every day and drive her home. That was my experience.
So, Jessica, did you find that working at the Atlantic and reading fiction submissions helped your writing, or did it just make you too tired to write on your own?
I always struggle with this because I don't know if it helped, but it's good to have an awareness, I think, of what's happening out there. It kind of puts you in context. And I did a lot of reading for Agni magazine for 10 years also, fast forward, not so long ago. And I think it just keeps you reading. It's exciting to know what people are thinking about and sort of to see the currents of what's on people's minds, because you do see these trends. And I think that probably has some influence on some level.
Now, you set your novel Strangers in Budapest in post-communist Hungary. What attracted you to that setting?
Well, every year, my husband and I used to go over to Europe for 2 weeks. And at that time, I think it was right in the early 90s, people were talking about Budapest and Hungary was, and all those Eastern Bloc countries were sort of opening up, and it was exciting. I mean, the Soviets were leaving. It was just a new time. And so we decided to go. We had a friend who had another friend who was Hungarian American, and he said we should go over with this guy, George. So that's what we did. We went over for a week, and he could speak fluent Hungarian, and he gave us a whole tour of the city, and it was just so fascinating. I mean, to walk into this time capsule of something that had been really untouched for so many decades. So that was intriguing to us, and we always had sort of a desire to do more than just travel for a week or two overseas and to really go and live somewhere. And I'm glad we did that. It really changes your whole perspective about at least who you are as an American in the world.
I have two questions that are related to one another. The first was about your transition from your writing practice, transition from writing a memoir to a novel. And the second is, in terms of your process, has it changed between your first novel and the current one? So I guess we're looking for the progressiveness of your process and practice.
Okay, so you were asking, because I haven't written a memoir yet. So I have, my first novel, then I have a collection of stories, and then Strangers in Budapest, and this is, a novel. So in terms of how is Night Swim different from Strangers to this one, are you asking, or?
Yeah, in terms of your process or how you actually write these.
Okay, all right. So I learned a very big lesson about myself this year, I will say. I tried to put this novel together by putting together a synopsis first. I think I was trying to sort of, which works for some people, and it just did not work for me at all. And so that was a very big lesson that I learned this year, and I'm glad I learned it. And so what I want to go back to saying is that I'm the kind of writer who is usually driven by some kind of emotion, and I'm interested in relationships and characters. And I just have to know who those characters are and what their problems are. And from that arise the wheres and whats and what happens next kind of stuff. But I don't really like to know exactly what happens when I'm writing a novel. I like to be there experiencing it. And that was my big lesson that I learned again, because that's usually how I do write, but I tried to do it a little differently this time. And now I've gone back to that. I'm feeling better. So it's a little messier. It's a messier process.
Now, when I do Q&A from the group here, I think new questions are stimulated from the older ones or your answers. So I'm going to jump back to Hungary. And the question is, what do you think of Hungary now?
Well, what do I think of the world? I mean, what do I think of America? So it's, people are disappointing, I mean, I think the change is hard. So when we were in Hungary, there was a lot of excitement because the Russians were gone. There were all these changes. And I think the younger generation was excited. The older generation was really afraid. And I think there was a push-pull. And then there was also a group they were kind of like skinheads that were forming back then. And they were just a small amount of kids. But I think change gets scary. And so either some people embrace it or some people pull back to what they want, the old, or they want something stricter. And I guess maybe that's happening here. I don't know.
All right, so I guess now we're jumping back to you as a fiction editor. So what would be an example of a trend that you notice when you're reading fiction submissions?
Well, I remember back in the day, let's say the Atlantic, everything was in continuous present tense. It was just, everyone was writing like that. I don't know if that was like an Ann Beatty thing. And of course it depends upon who you're reading for. That's a really key thing. So, if you're thinking about where do I send my stuff, you really have to look at that magazine, because the stuff that Agni's looking for is not going to be the same thing that the Atlantic's looking for, and et cetera, et cetera. So, working at the, reading for Agni, we were looking for stuff that had sort of more grittiness and pushing boundaries and, playing with form, let's say, a little more license in that way, that in ways that probably the Atlantic would never touch. So, but I'm not reading for anyone at this moment, except for the manuscript consultations that I'm doing at Grub. So I can't really give you a trend right now, to be honest.
So, what kind of fiction would you pass on when you were a fiction editor? And is there anything specific that would knee-jerk reject a submission for you?
Well, yeah, a billion things. I mean, you know, honestly, you can tell on the first page. It's, you know, you feel that the writer has control of voice. You know, the line by line writing, again, just the quality of the writing. And, you know, you feel that the writer has control of the words and the word choices and not having cliches, a different point of view, just something that gives something distinctive and unique about the whole presentation, whether it's how the author is seeing something or the characters are seeing or speaking, experiencing things. So, and it's something that I think you just develop over time when you're reading a lot of stuff.
Okay, and Josh was asking, he seems, he's really curious about your relationship with Judaism based on how you opened your reading and how that influences your process in writing your novel.
Yeah.
And I'm also interested in your own internal exodus and Omer while working on your novel. Would you please share about this if you're comfortable?
Oh, okay. I have a very conflicted relationship with who I am as a Jew. Less conflicted now than I mean, the fact that I actually said that as an introduction to this novel says that I'm more comfortable as a, I don't know, non-practicing Jew, a Jew whose grandmother was very Orthodox Jewish, whose parents were not very religious, but I did go to Sunday school. And I'm really not someone who aspires necessarily to one particular religion at all. But I like taking tenets from different religions. And I do feel that I am Jewish as a kind of, I don't know, cultural thing maybe. And the fact that my father did fight in World War II in the army, and he did help liberate Dachau. So I feel a sensitivity about being Jewish because of the Holocaust and my father's experience. Okay, so that I think was answer one about my relationship with being Jewish, maybe. And the second question, the follow-up to that was?
Interested in your own internal exodus and Omer while working on your novel.
I think that has to do with, well, I'm discovering it as I write, but I think the fact that I'm willing to incorporate this old Jewish tradition that I just learned about actually last year, just by accident. I have a friend who's very, I guess she would call herself very religious, Orthodox Jew. She happened to mention in passing, and I just said, what is that? And she told me what it was. It's a 49-day tradition where every day you count the day, and in each day and week sort of has a kind of theme to it, where you look at different nuances about love and loving kindness and giving and charity. And, you know, do you give out of obligation, or do you give out of generosity? Do you give because you're judgmental? I don't know. It's interesting. I became fascinated with that. And part of something in my novel is I really wanted to explore this idea of being enslaved by our own sort of either bad habits or negative thinking, bad things that have happened to us, and to get to a place where you can forgive. There's something liberating in that. And so this counting the Omer is, you know, does span from escape from Egypt, which is a liberation, and the crossing through the wilderness, and that process of it takes time to change and do that. So
Okay, final question. Who were your influences when you were young and learning to love to read and starting to write? Who were your influences then compared to your influences now?
Well, I started off, I mean, I read fairy tales I have to say that because I love them, and I started off writing short stories, so I love the short form. And I think they probably had an influence. There's some kind of mythological aspect to a fairy tale, and there's a journey that every character in a fairy tale goes through. What else? Okay, so then I read a lot of the classics. I mean, all the Russians and the French. I mean, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Camus, and and then, oh gosh, I mean, there's too many to name. And there's the American Flannery O'Connor and Jane Austen and all that stuff, and Brontes, and now I'm Marilyn Robinson. I adore Elizabeth Strout. So I guess, what do I want to say? I mean, I don't read science fiction. I do like, I guess from the classics to pushing the envelope a little bit, maybe. I don't know if that, I mean, I could go on forever about this, so.
I'm guessing your bookshelf is to your left, because when you're thinking about your influences, you're checking your bookshelf out.
There it is.
You have a very large bookshelf. There it is. Fantastic.
I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, actually, my husband built it.
And finally, the very last question, there is one more. Has the pandemic influenced your writing at all?
Oh boy. Has the pandemic influenced my writing? I think, I mean, I've struggled in terms of, in the beginning of the pandemic, the whole thing of is writing a novel valuable and worthwhile? There's this worldwide pandemic and it's a disaster. And then I've come to this place of absolutely, it's critical, more important than ever, and absolutely necessary. So it's influenced me in that way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Jessica. And
thank you.
Everybody, check out some of her books, which are Strangers in Budapest, which she talked about in the Q&A, the novel Night Swim, and her short story book, Women in Bed. And you can purchase those at Porter Square Books, Newtonville Books, and the Brookline Booksmith, which I don't have up on the screen, but you can Google Brookline Booksmith. And I'm going to stop the people that are watching live on Facebook. Good night.
Bye-bye.
And if anyone wants to participate in the open mic that on Facebook, just log into the Zoom account either now or next week. So, Jessica.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Jessica.